Hello and welcome to the channel today. I'm Will and I'm going to be discussing everything I had to read during my first year at Durham University. So before I get into the list, I'll just set a bit of context. I'm studying an English and History joint honours. So this list will mostly be comprised of the text I read for English, because for history, it's much more about academic papers, snippets from here, there, and everywhere. So I won't be discussing them. I'll be discussing kind of bigger texts and works. And so that means that my split is 50% history, 50% English. So other people's lists who did a straight English degree was much higher in terms of larger texts. I think that the reading list is probably the same. I probably read the same amount for history as I did read for English. And so this is probably representing half of what I actually read for this first year. It's been great. A lot of them are books I wouldn't have picked up if it hadn't been for being on the reading list. And some, they didn't click with me, but others have gone into my favourites, and it's really helped to broaden my horizons. So now let's get into it and talk about what I read for my first year at Durham. And so the first text I read was Beowulf. What an awesome place to start. I'll talk about it here and with many more to come. It is such a shame that there is this myth that the older texts are not accessible, that the common reader would not be able to pick up and enjoy Beowulf. This is so accessible, so enjoyable, and easier to read, in my opinion, than many books that are released today. It is gripping, it is entertaining, and I think these Anglo-Saxon and Old Norse texts feel so fresh because they follow a different narrative style. They're not following kind of the constraints and the expectations that we see in all the books that we read nowadays. Beowulf, I chose this edition, Tom Shippey. I read Seamus Heaney's Tolkien's and Tom Shippey's because I just fell in love with Beowulf, and I wanted to see the nuances, the slight differences, different interpretations. But I chose to show this one by Tom Shippey. I remember I picked this up because I watched an interview Tom Shippey had with Dr. Fantasy Philip Chase himself, and it was just fascinating. I instantly went away, purchased this edition, read it, and loved it. And I actually read this 3 times this year because I read it once at the beginning, then I had a mock exam and I chose a Beowulf question, so I read it again, and then in my final exam I read it again. So I read it 3 times, each time so enjoyable. I love the different things you pick up on, and this module for my degree, it was the Epic and Legend of Literature, and probably my favourite module on the English side. It was absolutely gripping. I love Beowulf. It's a tale everyone knows, but I really recommend picking up this material. Tom Shippey's edition is fantastic, but if you want to dive into some Tolkien, pick up his translation instead. Now I'm going to be talking about some smaller ones. This is a book of Anglo-Saxon verse. I didn't have to read all of the text in here, although I've read most of them before. I'll just read out a few that I did have to read if I can find the pages. So, of course, it's Anglo-Saxon verse. The clues in the word, what's going to be found in these pages. So I read The Wife's Lament, The Dream of the Rood, The Wanderer, and The Seafarer. And I want to talk a bit more about The Wanderer, because if you're a fan of Lord of the Rings and Tolkien, you have to read The Wanderer. There may be a little piece there that relates to something Theoden says. I'll leave it at that. Hopefully that's intrigued you, and hopefully you pick up these. Most of them are very short, and they're just, again, accessible, gripping, and I love the depth we see. A key kind of detail is this idea of isolation, duty, restoration as well. And yeah, I really enjoyed these. I think my highlight of the whole module was Beowulf, and another one I'll talk about later on, but they were really enjoyable as well. And especially when I had seminars discussing them and untangling kind of the complexities, it was fascinating. But now on to, I had to read some Tolkien, and I had to read the Battle of Molden. So I read Tolkien's translation of the Battle of Molden. This was a historical battle as the Norse are making their threat known on the shores, and it's a battle of a Saxon leader standing against them. And so there's a debate. He invites them onto the shore, he lets them land and face up against him, and the question is, was this kind of stupidity and arrogance letting them line up so it was an even battle where the Saxons eventually lost, or was it courage? Because maybe the Norse, the Vikings, would have gone further up the coast and raided somewhere unprotected. And so Bjornorth is kind of seen as this Saxon hero, but underneath there is an undercurrent of, can we pick up this idea of arrogance as well? I love it. This is just exactly what I'm looking for in this module. It's looking at these characters who are idealized. They're representing the ideals, the heroic ideals of the age, and I think it reveals so much about the culture at the time that makes it just really brilliant to dive into. And so, yeah, how is it that I've somehow managed to have Tolkien on my reading list? It's pretty cool, isn't it? Not everybody can say that. And then I have Emma, which is, of course, a Victorian tale. I was a bit conflicted with Emma. It's a classic, of course, but it was one that I wasn't that sure about. I really liked the period we're set in, and I like a lot of the dialogue. I found it very sharp, very witty, very gripping. But the main character, Emma, I found her quite infuriating, quite self-important. And while it's fine to have a character like that and you can still love a book, it was done in a way that, I don't know, I just couldn't invest myself in a lot of this. I really appreciate the craft and the writing style, but Emma was not for me. However, next up, Jane Eyre. This was something that did click with me. I really love the dark kind of gothic tone that you have in a lot of Jane Eyre. I also watched a film with Michael Fassbender in, which was really great. I loved that as well. But Jane Eyre, I loved the writing style, and it did a lot that Jane Eyre attempted to, in my opinion, but Jane Eyre succeeded in it. Of course, very different position. Jane Eyre, our main character, is from a very different social background. She is not as high up as our character Emma, who is so self-important. Jane Eyre is lower down in the echelons of society, and so when she gains the attentions of someone she's serving, then it causes some complications, we'll say, both internal and external. But I really liked how it was written. I liked the build and tension, and the setting and the culture was really explored well. And Jane Eyre is just one that is lasting with me, and I would actually like to read again. I think I'd appreciate it more, having done a lot of reading around the context and craft of Jane Eyre. And then next up, I have a play, and this is Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe. So Marlowe was a rival of Shakespeare, and Faustus is where the term Faustian comes from, this idea of a character selling their soul to the devil in return for, I don't know, immortality or great power, and so on and so forth. Dr. Faustus in this, he's a great scientist, he's incredibly intelligent, but he just doesn't have that desire he just knows everything, basically, that he wants to know about, so he turns to black magic. And he summons a demon to make a deal with the devil that for, I forgot how many years, I think it might be 20 years of having unlimited power and during this time, then he will sell his soul to the devil, which to me doesn't really seem worth it. 20 years of being able to do whatever you want in return for an eternity in hell, not really sure. But one of the takes on Faustus is that he's so arrogant that he thinks that he will be able to worm his way out of the deal at the end. I really loved this exploration of character in Faustus. There's a lot of humour in this, and of course it's showing basically the message is don't sell your soul to the devil, it's not worth it. I think that's quite obvious from the start, but the journey to get there is really fascinating, really engaging, and it's just brilliant writing, and one of my favourite plays. I actually read it for the first time, I think 5 years ago, as I started college, and it was just really, really great then, but I enjoyed it more on a reread. Then I have Heart of Darkness. So this, of course, one of the most classic books of all time. I've talked about it quite a bit on the Brothers Grimm because I've read it twice this year. Similarly to Beowulf, I read it once as to start the reading list, and then again when it came to my exam and I was covering it as a text. Heart of Darkness is one that I enjoyed it more each time I read it. The first time I read it, I wasn't so sure. The second time a bit more, and the third time a bit more. This is about a descent into madness. I do really enjoy how the focus of the book changes. At first, it's kind of that normal narrative of so our character's going into the depths of the Congo to get ivory. But as he becomes warped into this world and kind of obsessed with the character of Kurtz, who he's after, then you kind of forget about the ivory. And I love how the story and narrative changes, and that really reflects the evolution of the character as well. I think obviously Conrad, he's a master of his craft, especially in Heart of Darkness, and I don't think that can be disputed. But it's not a book for everyone, but it's one that I wouldn't say I love still, but I deeply respect, and it was really fascinating learning about this and diving into the context as well, because it's just one of those that there's so much to dive into. I think it's impossible to cover everything with Heart of Darkness because there is just so much you could talk about. I think if I talked about it for the whole time, it would probably be a 3-4 hour long video. And then I have the Völuspá, which is about the beginning and end of the world and its rebirth in Norse mythology. This can be quite dense at times. There's a lot of references in the Völuspá that now we don't know. There's a lot of references to what people believe are deities or histories that over time have just been forgotten and they haven't been recorded. And so there's a lot of gaps where we can have to use our own imagination to see what they mean. And so there is that ambiguity about the Völuspá. It's one that I decided to focus on other texts. I read it, enjoyed it, but I decided to focus on others, Beowulf being one of them, and others that I'll talk about soon in this video as I cover them. But Völuspá, another one that is just, I just love Old English and Old Norse texts, and this diving into those mythologies is just wonderful. And it's one of the reasons I chose to go to Durham, because of the focus on that in the English module, in the English degree, sorry, one of the modules basically dedicated to that each year. And so, yeah, I loved that. The Völuspá, really interesting, but I focused on other texts. But another one that kind of follows in the same category for me as the Völuspá is the Atlakvitha. So we've got a character, Gudrun. Her brothers are killed by Atli, better known as Attila. And so, but she is the wife of Attila / Atli. And so it's this conundrum, this conscience battle of avenging your family or standing by your husband. And I'll let the rest of the tale pan out. Hopefully you read it, but this was brilliant. I loved this strong female protagonist who, well, is she a protagonist? Obviously the hegemonic values of the time, is it painting Gudrun as kind of this evil, crazy woman? Or is she a hero who's kind of discarding those gender stereotypes and standing up for her family? Who knows? And I love that ambiguity. I love when you can really dive into two very disparate, separate takes on a text, and this is one of those that falls into that. But I did focus on other texts, as I said before, the Völuspá, and so let's dive into them. Egils Saga. It's a saga, as you can tell by the name. It is a family tale, really, of the family and their enmity with the kings of Norway. And our titular character Egils Skallagrimsson, is one of the members of this family. The rivalry starts way before him, generations before, but it carries until him. He is a great warrior. He's quite crazy. Don't give him an axe when he's below the age of 10, because he will go after you if you upset him. You do not want to be on his bad side. He's probably, I don't know, one of the first anti-heroes in text that I've come across, because he does some bad things. He causes anarchy, he causes chaos. He often jumps to conclusions, but he is who you're rooting for, because he stands for what he believes is right. He makes sure to stand by the people that he believes in and the people who are good, really. And the kings of Norway are shown as more of the enemies. This is an Icelandic text, so it's kind of highlighting the freedom of Iceland and how that's better than the oppressive rule of a monarchy. And so that kind of propaganda falls into place with Egils Saga, and I love how it doesn't fall into the contemporary narrative. It's a story following Egil. It's not going to be a book that starts with Egil, becomes a hero, gathers an army and crushes the kings of Norway. It's not like that. It's realistic. There are fantastical elements, but it's more realistic in the sense of Egil doesn't have that agency, so we follow him around in what would be a few different narratives. He heads over to England and plays his role there. If you've read Bernard Cornwell's Saxon Stories, you may recognise the name of Egils Skallagrimsson. And so I love that Easter egg in Bernard Cornwell's series. But yeah, that is Egils Saga. And another one was Cers Saga. This is much smaller scale, much more intimate. So Gisli, he's got his brother, and he lives on a farm with his brother. Gisli marries and he becomes very close to his brother-in-law. His brother marries and becomes very close to his brother-in-law. So there's these four that are kind of drawn together, but some enmities and conflicts arise. This is much more intimate, as I said. There are still fantastical elements, but it's a lot more honed down and not as fantastical or magical as Egils Saga is. And so it feels a lot more realistic in that sense. I'd say I slightly preferred Egils Saga, but Gisli Saerson was still very fresh, really great. I love the humour, the dark humour, and also the creativity and imagination of these sagas. Our characters very often find themselves in places and events where you think, how can they escape? How can they survive this? But they use something really creative to escape. And sometimes it's really funny, sometimes it's really random, and sometimes it's just genius. And I love that imagination that is shown in the sagas. I'll definitely be reading more, but they were the two on my reading list. And then I have Bleak House by Charles Dickens. I was conflicted on this. Charles Dickens, I've loved his writing in the past. A Tale of Two Cities I've read, and of course, A Christmas Carol. But Bleak House is very different. I found the first half to be very, very dense. It is about this law case where anyone who can be discerned as a direct descendant and kind of make sense of the will that was left by this very rich person will receive the inheritance, basically. And it is something that's been going on many and many a year. Loads of people have gone saying that they should be the rightful inheritor, but they haven't succeeded, but it's still going on. And so a lot of this is about a tale of greed and avarice and how it corrupts people and the money is not worth it. But it also becomes a murder mystery as well. So the first half I thought was very dense, and I actually watched the adaptation as well, the programme, and I thought very similar things. The first half, quite weak, didn't enjoy either of them. The second half, though, when it turns into more of this murder mystery and piecing the jigsaw puzzle together, was really satisfying and really engaging and thrilling. I just think it took too long to get there. And with the jigsaw pieces, I just wasn't invested enough for it to feel like really hard work for little reward. But the end, it ended strong. And so Bleak House, very conflicted. It really is two sides of a coin. And yes, but I'm still glad I read it. But it was, I think, 1,000 pages. And so it was quite a struggle. You can forgive maybe 100 pages of it being slow, but 500 of a slog. It felt difficult, but obviously I had to do it. And so that is Bleak House. And then I have something much more positive on this. Watchman by Alan Moore. The lecturer who talked about Watchman, he said he thinks it's really brilliant that when he started lecturing, never would Watchman even have been considered for a reading list. But over the last few decades, so much more respect has been given to other forms of the novel that fall outside the classics. And Watchman is one of those that has benefited. And I love the analysis of the mind in here. Watchmen, we've got a bunch of heroes who they are now vigilantes or have had to retire, but it shows the minds of actual heroes. So they put capes on and they're standing for what most people believe is right, but how does that corrupt them? What are their motivations? It is a psychological analysis, and also how constant conflict and death can really just erode the soul. That is all very key to Watchmen. I think the first 3 quarters I absolutely adored. In the last quarter, it became a bit too large scale, where I preferred the more intimate analysis of the characters and their own narratives that fall within that. As I said, the last quarter became a bit too large scale for my liking, so it wasn't bad. It was quite a satisfying end, but it just didn't hold to the same level as the rest. But Watchmen, I can totally see why it's so respected and why it has been so integral to the evolution of the graphic novel genre. So that is Watchmen. And then what have I got next? The only book I'm including here for history is How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. This actually wasn't on my reading list, but I read it because it would have been so core to the module. And so I was looking at power in Africa. And obviously that's very broad, and so we did a lot of case studies within that module, but I decided to read this because it's known as a key text. And yeah, it's just, it's quite difficult to read at times because it is so sad, and kind of reading about the exploitation of Africa over the centuries is just devastating. And so I still think it's a very important read. It's one of those that often there's things that we'd rather be ignorant of, but I think it's very important to know about history, especially with kind of the modules that I was covering. I think it's very important to face the facts and be knowledgeable about this, and so don't make the same mistakes in the future, or be able to see when they're happening. And so I think this was very important to read, and it's the only one that I'll include on here for the history lens, because the rest, as I said, were academic papers. But then something else which I read in the novel module for English, but it was showing how the novel can kind of be subverted. This is In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. This is what the author himself, labelled as the first non-fiction novel. This is true crime. It is about a horrific murder of a family, I believe in the 1950s or maybe very early 1960s in Kansas. It is true. In Cold Blood was one of the best-selling books of the 20th century in America, and Truman Capote was launched to stardom. It was very interesting that very key to the research of In Cold Blood was Harper Lee, the author of To Kill a Mockingbird. And so it's really interesting looking at the backgrounds of these authors and how they all really seem to know each other and link in the background. In Cold Blood feels very different because it's not just telling you about how this murder took place. It is a dive into the minds of the murderers, which is horrifying, but fascinating at the same time. But also, Truman Capote, I think, is great that he takes the time to not just look at the immediate victims, but also the survivors, how they have been impacted, how it's changed their life, and how it stays with them, seeing these events and living with the aftermath. I thought that's something that's rarely seen and should be dwelled on more. And Truman Capote grew very close to the murderers in the sense he spent a lot of time with them. And so that added layer to the book, added a lot more complexity, and I thought about it a lot more. Every word, it just seemed like there was kind of a veiled subtext as well, which made it really just a magnetic read, even though it is so horrifying and dark and shocking as well. Alright, I promise we're near the end. Only got a few left. So next up I have another play. It is The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. This is just a witty kind of deconstruction of class society, mocking it, mocking those of the upper classes, and why is this system in place. But in a way where it's like a veiled insult, where if you go in as, or the people of the time went in as aristocracy, they probably wouldn't notice how they were being mocked. And I love how cleverly Oscar Wilde does that. And so yeah, that was The Importance of Being Earnest. And I also watched the film as well, which was really good. I also read another play by Oscar Wilde. This wasn't part of the reading list. It was A Woman of No Importance. I read this because I was actually in the play in Durham, and somehow I got one of the main roles, which was just absolutely amazing. I was honoured to be given that role, and I absolutely loved it. I had to play a character who was quite charismatic. He's very nasty as well, but I just found that so fun to do. Obviously, I'm a very amateur actor, but I do love doing it. And because of time constraints, I couldn't do any more plays. But yeah, the one I went for was absolutely amazing. It was an incredible experience. And yeah, so maybe I feel a bit more sentimental value towards Oscar Wilde, and maybe a bit protective of A Woman of No Importance as well, which is why I'll probably enjoy it a bit more than The Importance of Being Earnest. But of course, that's biased because I've really looked into every line and the subtext and all the characters and their motives in A Woman of No Importance far more, obviously. And then I've got The Second Shepherds and Everyman, which are morality plays. I believe 15th and 16th centuries. It's been quite a few months now since I actually read these, so I'm trying to remember. And Second Shepherds was okay. It was a morality play. It was a bit too preachy for me, but it was good that I read it. Everyman, however, this was a very different type of morality play. It was also allegorical. You've got a man who's named Everyman, and he's told that the end of his life is coming and he's going to Judgment Day. And so obviously he's panicking. He's going to try and take some people with him to vouch for him, but all these people do not go with him until he finds some that will. So the morality play lies within that, and I found this far more enjoyable, because even though it was a morality play and obviously preaching a didactic message, it was done in a way that I enjoyed far more. And I think that is almost everything. I have the Song of Roland, which is Old French, and it is the tale of Roland, who is meant to be the nephew of Charlemagne, as he stood in a battle and died for Christendom. I found this just to be not good at all. I think it was my least favourite read of the entire year at uni, just because whilst many of these older texts, they do obviously have a very religious message at the core, I found that whoever wrote the Song of Roland, they expected you to love the character just based off their religion. It would introduce their religion and then have them killed off and expect you to feel emotion just because they were Christian or Muslim. And that just did not sit well with me, because there was no other characterization except with Roland really done. And so, yeah, and it was just one character after the other in this battle, which could have been very epic, but it just wasn't. And so yeah, that is quite a negative way to finish on, but that is the list of most of the things that I've read for my first year at uni. There was more on the reading list, but it's done in a way where you don't have to read everything. So these are the ones that I actually read. And so, yeah, that's quite a lot, actually, reflecting on it. And as that's only basically half of my degree, and I think I've read about double if I include all the history stuff, I'm actually impressed. I'm impressed how much I did, but it also shows why it does envelop all your other reading. Anything that I've wanted to pick up myself, I've listened to via Audible. I haven't been able to pick up anything physically until about a month ago, just because of those demands of uni. Of course, you're there full time and it's what is expected, and I can't complain about it. It's what I'm there to do. But yeah, so I'm very happy that most of the texts that were set clicked with me. And some of them are going down as favourites. Egils Saga, Beowulf, Watchman and Cold Blood, in particular, the ones that just kind of jump out at me. So yeah, that is my list of what I've read for my first year at Durham University. Hopefully you are fascinated. Hopefully there's some of these that may have intrigued you. Please, please, please pick up some Old English or Old Norse if you haven't already. I would just love to talk to more people about it, and I want to dispel this myth that it's not accessible. But everyone, thank you so much for watching, and stay safe.